It is interesting that this week I was planning to record a video about the hanging pawn center, and Ding Lireng and Nepo decided to play the hanging pawn center position on their fourth game of the World Chess Championship. So I found it fitting to share the principles of how to play the hanging pawn center positions and then demonstrate those principles analyzing Nepo and Ding's game. Hey chess masters, Coach Sipho here, and those who have been following this channel know that we are currently dealing with the 5 different types of centers, middle game course or series. We did explain on our intro video that there are millions of openings and you certainly can't study all of them. But one thing is for sure, all these openings will transpose into one of these 5 centers. So if you make a commitment to master these 5 different types of centers, you will be able to understand any middle game position. As we discussed on the previous videos, a hanging pawn center position is when one side managed to move his pawn 2 squares towards the center. So one side needs to have 2 pawns that moved 2 squares towards the center, whereas the other side doesn't have a pawn that moved 2 squares towards the center. For example, we get this position from the Queen's Gambit accepted variation. After c4, black takes, and then let's say white plays pawn to e4. And we can all see that white has 2 pawns that moved to the center. And black doesn't have a pawn that moved 2 squares towards the center. Even though black had a pawn that moved 2 squares towards the center previously, but now it got exchanged. After this, only white now has 2 pawns in the center. This is the hanging pawn center. Now, let's discuss the principles that you need to keep in mind when you play positions with the hanging pawn center. We are going to start with when you play for the pawn center, and then after that we are going to discuss principles you need to keep in mind when you play against the pawn center. So what should you do when you are the one having the pawn center? Okay, first let's discuss the advantages that you have when you have a pawn center, so that you will be motivated to fight for the hanging pawn center. The advantage that you will get when you have a pawn center is that you have more space than your opponent. As you can see that your pieces have more room to maneuver, whereas the opponent has a very little room to move their pieces around. So the opponent is cramped. Another reason is that since you have too much space, you could develop your minor pieces with freedom, whereas the opponent's pieces could always be pushed back. You see now that knight will have to go back, and then after this the knight will also have to go back. That's the disadvantage of not having a pawn in the center. So that is the advantage of having the pawn center. It gives you more space and your pieces could be developed easily without the fear of being pushed back. Now, what are the principles you should keep in mind when you have the hanging pawn center? When you have the hanging pawn center, we already discussed that you can develop your pieces more freely and your opponent's pieces could be pushed back. That means at the end of the day, you will have more activity than the opponent. And as we have learned from the previous videos, the side that has more activity will always be favored by tactics. So the only disadvantage of having the pawn center is that you will have to defend that center. So once you have the pawn center, make sure you develop your pieces while at the same time trying to defend these pawns. See, since they are not defended by pawns. And then after that, you will castle. Then you will make sure that you overprotect these pawns. Once you overprotect these pawns, and then you can not lose them even when they are attacked, now you can move on. You can shift your attention from defending the pawns to attacking the opponent's weakness. You will look on the board and spot where are the opponent's weaknesses and start to attack them. Those are the plans when you are having a hanging pawn center. Keep in mind, before you start attacking opponent's weaknesses, first you need to overprotect that pawn center. Otherwise, once that pawn center collapses, then you no longer have the advantage. The position will be equal. Okay, now that you understand how to play for the pawn center, let's now go ahead and discuss how do you actually play against the hanging pawn center. If you are the one playing against the hanging pawn center, you need to develop your pieces, and then you need to put as much as possible pressure on those pawns until one of them advance. For example, if this one advances, then you will take, and then if the opponent takes, they no longer have the 2 pawns in the center, so you destroyed their pawn center. So you need to attack, put too much pressure, try to attack these pawns, attack, and then after that, when the opponent realizes that you are putting too much pressure on these pawns, eventually they will push one of these pawns and you would have destroyed that pawn center. If they push this one, that's good for us, because before we did not have this square, but now since this pawn is no longer here, we can place our pieces in front of these pawns now, and this is called a blockade. You are blocking these pawns, and once you blockade them, they are no longer as dangerous as before. Remember, their main threat was that they could always advance and push your pieces back. But once you blockade them, as we can see, this one is blocked by the knight, this one is blocked by the pawn. They cannot advance and they are not dangerous. Now, after blockading these pawns, your next step as black is to try to destroy these pawns, or you can leave them like this and attack opponent's weaknesses. Let's say the opponent has some undefended pawns, you can go for those pawns, or if the king is weak, you can go for the king. So you attack weaknesses or destroy these pawns by undermining them. For example, you could push the pawn to c5 when you are ready to do so. Maybe you could start with the knight here and then push the pawn. You are destroying this pawn center now. Or maybe you could go for another plan, which is to attack the pawn that is in front and try to destroy those pawns. That's how you play against the hanging pawn center. Okay, now that we understand the principles of how to play for and against the hanging pawn center, let's go ahead and analyze the game that was played in the World Chess Championship. Okay, just to give you a brief background of this game. This is the 4th game. They drew the 1st game, Nepo won the 2nd game. They drew the 3rd game, and this was the 4th game, and Ding was under pressure to try and equalize the score. And Ding Liren did equalize the game. So let's see how they played it. We are not really interested on these moves until we get to a position where we have a hanging pawn center. Okay, now we can already see that white has a hanging pawn center. 2 or more pieces are occupying the center. That means white moved these 2 pawns 2 squares. Whereas on the other hand, black does not have a pawn that is occupying the center. Remember, the center is these 4 central squares, and black does not have any pawn that is occupying these squares. You already know the principles now. White will have to overprotect the central pawns, and then black will have to put too much pressure on these hanging pawn center and try to win them or force one of them to advance forward so that he will be able to blockade them. Okay, we can see that black is already trying to put pressure on these pawns. White is trying to protect them. Black is attacking them. White is defending. This pawn, this move is indirectly attacking the center, because let's face it, from there the bishop cannot directly attack these pawns, but then by coming here it is indirectly attacking the center because it is attempting to remove one of the defenders of these pawns. Remember, if you can attack with your pieces, then you gotta remove the pieces that are defending. Ding removed his knight because he realized that his knight is playing a part in fighting for those pawns, in defending the pawns, whereas the bishop is not attacking those pawns, trying to attack these pawns. Okay, that's a beautiful move because black, remember we said the main threat of having the pawn center is that these pawns could always advance forward and push your pieces back. White realizes if he pushes the pawn immediately, black will take, and then white will lose the pawn and will lose his hanging pawn center. So what white decided to do is that he sacrificed this pawn so that when he pushes this pawn will no longer be able to take it. Nepo took the pawn. Now when the pawn gets to e5, it could no longer be captured now. And pay attention that white is also discovering an attack to the h7 pawn. So black was forced to defend that pawn, and then that pawn advanced, and in the process it takes away the square for the knight. We can see that black is getting cramped here. Black doesn't have enough space to move his pieces around. Good move by black, putting more pressure on these pawns. Ding decided to defend. With this move, black is threatening to go to b7 with his knight, so that after putting too much pressure on this pawn, hopefully this pawn will advance and black will be able to blockade. As we discussed, that when you play against the hanging pawn center, you need to put too much pressure on it. When one of the pawns advance, you will be able to blockade it. And we can already see the advantages of having the hanging pawn center. Your pieces have too much room to move around. As you can see, the bishop is moving around, also preventing black's knight from getting back to the game. Because after this move, white could always have possibilities of discovering an attack to that knight. Oh, by the way, black cannot take this pawn. Remember, I told you that tactics will always favor the side that is ahead in activity. In this position, white's pieces are more active than black's pieces. So tactics will always favor white in this position. If black takes, then white can always temporarily sacrifice a bishop, check, and then after that, white will win that rook. Okay, black is doing the right black is doing the right thing, trying to put more pressure on these pawns. And we can see that this is the most vulnerable one, since it is not defended by other pawns. This one is defended by the pawn, by the bishop. This one is not defended by the pawn. And so you will try to defend the most vulnerable one. It doesn't make sense to attack the one that is well defended. That's a good move. overprotecting that pawn, attacking that pawn. Good. Okay, this move opens the way for the rook. Now the rook is also defending that pawn one more time. And pay attention, if black takes, the knight will take and overprotect that pawn. Okay, white is coming back to the game now. And pay attention, that move no longer works now because black can always take and the rook would defend the knight. White is also trying to double on the e-file and overprotect that pawn, since black is also doing the same thing, putting too much pressure on this pawn. Okay, black is undermining this hanging pawn center, attacking it with too much pressure, and eventually the pawn was forced to advance. And now remember, once the pawn advances, it leaves some of the squares weak, and now black will be able to blockade, which is what Nepo did. Okay, white is trying to put more pressure, attacking the weaknesses now. Black is defending the weakness, attacking that weakness one more time. Now this is where Nepo blundered. Nepo was supposed to play g5, protect the pawn. There are no dangers. Black has more pieces on the king side, so he could afford to move pawns, and he cannot be checkmated since he has enough pieces to defend. And remember, he dealt with the hanging pawn center. And then Ding decided to sacrifice the rook for activity, and then attacking that pawn. The reason for the sacrifice is that Ding is going for more activity now. He will take the pawn, and then after that he will occupy that weak square in black's territory, forcing black's pieces to move away and stop blockading the pawn. And once the pawn is no longer blockaded, it could advance forward. By the way, this move doesn't work because I thought of this move, and I thought if black plays this move, now the white knight can no longer get there, because after this move, there is no way for the knight to go there now, because that square is controlled by the pawn, so the knight cannot get there. This square is controlled, so I saw no way of getting there. But then, if white won't win positionally, then white will win in a dynamic way. For example, white can start pushing. Remember, that pawn is no longer there now. And we know the threat of having the hanging pawn center is that they can always advance, and that is the most dangerous thing about hanging pawns. Once you allow them to advance, remember at first, this pawn was preventing the knight, the d5 pawn from advancing, because if the d5 pawn advances, it could always be captured. But if you defend that pawn, now that pawn is no longer there, meaning the pawn could advance. So after pawn d6, then the pawn advances and you cannot catch it. And if you go behind the pawn, it leads to a quick checkmate after after queen a8. This is the only way to get out of check. Then queen e8, that's a checkmate. So that is why black couldn't defend this pawn. Instead, black decided to defend the f pawn now. And the knight can always occupy these weak squares in black's territory. The reason white wanna occupy those squares is mainly because he wants to remove the blockade. Remember, if you can get your hanging pawn center moving forward, then it's always dangerous. But once it is blockaded, it is not as dangerous. Okay, Ding decided to play there, so that he will be able to play knight there, remove that rook. And also the pawn to g4 prevents any black's counter attacks. Okay, by the way, that was unpercent. You can take the pawn as if it moved one square. Is another pawn move. I know most players don't know it. If you don't know how to do unpercent, I recommend that you watch one of my videos. I will pin it on the description along with the other types of centers we already dealt with. Okay, now removing the defender. Now, black doesn't have any counter attack now, because if black pushes this pawn will advance, and black cannot open the position and try to counter attack on the king side. So if this one goes forward, if this one goes forward, this one will advance. You don't want to capture and open lines for black. So if this one advances, this one goes forward. If this one advances, this one goes forward. You keep the position closed on the king side. So that is why Ding removed the queen, because if the queen remains here, once black pushes the pawn, unfortunately now you cannot push the pawn because your queen would be under attack. So you would be forced to exchange and open lines for black. Now, remember the pawns. After the knight went there, it removed the blockade, the blocking piece. Now, the pawn could be advanced now. And then the rest is history. Removing the blockade again. That piece is blocking our pawn. Our pawn wanna go forward. So with this move, it forks the rook and the queen, but it wanna remove the blockade. Okay. So since the pawn is blockaded, black's activity is restricted, and white is trying to win that pawn. Black defends it. Okay, now white is trying to go there. Okay, now white can take the pawn, because after taking the pawn, black cannot take, otherwise the queen would be pinned, protected by the queen. Okay, let me quickly demonstrate it. White can simply take. If the queen takes, the rook will go to d7, pinning the queen. But then Ding decided to check first, so that he takes with a check. Still, the queen cannot take, because if the queen takes, the rook will go there, pinning the queen. And also the king cannot take. If the king takes, now the rook will go this side. That's a skewer. The king should move away and watch the queen dying. Okay, now the threat, since the rook is attacked, the threat is that white is planning to play rook e1, attacking the king. Once the king moves, white will win the rook. And again, the queen cannot take, because white will check, and then black will lose the queen. And then at this position, Nepo resigned. Okay, congratulations. Now you know how to play when you are having the hanging pawn center, and you also know how to play against the hanging pawn center. As we saw, that Nepo was putting too much pressure on those pawns until one of them was forced to advance. As soon as one of them advanced, Nepo did the right thing. He blockaded those pawns with his pieces. But then later on, Nepo removed the knight from blockading the pawns, and then Ding was able to sacrifice his rook, taking the knight and giving up the rook, because he understands that the knights are the best blockaders of the pawns. once he exchanges that knight, black will no longer be able to blockade those pawns effectively. To those who did not watch the previous videos, I recommend that you also learn the other types of centers. Once you know these 5 centers, then there is no need for you to master all openings. Even if you play an opening you don't know, it will transpose to one of these centers. And as long as you know how to play them, you will know the middle game plans. And please help our channel grow by smashing that subscribe button and click the bell so that you will be notified whenever we post videos. Until next time, peace.